Hello everyone, and welcome to another Magic the Gathering video. Although this one, whilst still focusing on a Brawl deck, is going to be a bit different from previously because it is going to be a bit more of a deck discussion, but not in the same vein as the other ones, other one I've previously done, because we're going to look at Syr Konrad the Grim, a Grim Tale, a deck that, as you can see, I've had more than one shot at. Because this is a deck that I really wanted to make work, but whether through bad luck with matching or just bad design on my part, probably a mix of both, it's just not ended up working out for me too well. However, it is something that I hope and am looking to rectify with the inclusion of the extra cards from Theros to be able to improve it. So that's basically what this video is going to mostly be today. I'll be going over quickly the 3 Konrad builds that I've got and the stories behind them and the ideas. And then I'm going to move into showing some gameplay still of games that I played with Konrad. And whilst doing that, I'll discuss the cards, since we now have the full spoilers from Theros Beyond Death. I'll go over the cards that I think could have some benefit, or cards that may have a benefit in the deck, but why I don't think they'd make the cut. So anyways, starting off, Syr Konrad the Grim. A legendary creature that whenever a creature dies, or a creature is put into the graveyard from anywhere other than the battlefield, or a creature leaves your graveyard specifically, it deals 1 damage to each opponent. So it's quite a stack of abilities, a wordy way of saying that basically whenever a creature goes into a graveyard, you deal 1 damage to each opponent. Whenever a creature comes out of your graveyard, you also deal 1 damage to your opponent, and obviously 1 for each creature. The idea with a deck like that is, well, you have a lot of creatures dying, you get a lot of, small amounts of drain here and there, and that eventually stacks up to win the game. And he's also got an activated ability, 1 black, to have each player put the top card of the library into their graveyard. Both of which being creatures, deals 2 damage, one of them a creature, 1 damage, neither, what can you do? With that in mind, this deck is quite heavily stacked on creatures versus non-creatures. Or at least the initial build. Since the idea was, if a creature dies and goes to the graveyard, that's good for me. If I'm using Konrad's ability, I want creatures to go to the graveyard. I then have the few support cards as ways to get those creatures out, and Ritual of Soot, which is the only board wipe you really have access to in black, but if it destroys my own creatures, if I've got Syr Konrad down, which is when I'll probably be using it in that instance, then I'm going to still be able to deal damage, and Konrad himself will survive. So, obviously then I load it with some things that can put additional cards into graveyards, because I'm, once again, more likely to have creatures that will get hit by that. Things that can bring themselves back, effects that will be useful, that require sacrifices, things that care about stuff dying, like Midnight Reaper, Plaguecrafter, adventure cards, since they are creatures, but they also then have the extra utility. Murderous Rider is an interesting one, since it dies, goes to graveyard, triggers Konrad, puts itself on the bottom, triggers Konrad again, which is the entire reason that the Cauldron of Eternity is in here. An artifact that is really, really questionable in design space at times, since it makes sense that, obviously, if you're able to just pay 3 mana and 2 life to return a creature from your graveyard to the battlefield, you don't want that ability to be able to be constantly recurring the same thing over and over again. So having creatures go to the bottom of the library works, but at the same time it's counterproductive to the sort of deck that would want the Cauldron of Eternity. I feel, however, that with Konrad it kind of works because of the fact that I want the creatures in graveyard and I want the creatures leaving the graveyard so that I get the additional triggers. It's essentially doubling the damage that Konrad is able to deal. And so it made sense, and because I've got a lot of creatures that should be in my graveyard, it should reasonably be quite cheap most of the time. In theory, at least. It didn't go so well. The issue with having this many creatures is, yeah, I collect yeah, it can get an additional trigger, but it's a 1/1 with flying. If I play it early, I'm milling before Conrad's down, and I'm not getting value from it. And if it hits after Conrad, the opponent's probably got an answer, or probably has a better flyer to block it. So it's not the best. And that's where the next issue comes in, is Conrad is 5 mana. He's a massive target. He'll hit the board, he'll die, and then there's not much I can do after that. The deck being built around Conrad being on the field only really works if Conrad's able to stick around on the field. In any game where he's not able to stick around, then it's worthless. And in a format where there's always going to be a card that your opponent is always going to have in hand, that they're going to want to play, having removal for it, funnily enough, is quite common. So after playing quite a large number of games, and it just not working out in the slightest, I talked with my partner a bit to see what he thought, since he was discussing that he wanted to make a Conrad deck, and so I was like, here, have a look at mine. What would you do differently? And we're still pretty creature heavy, but we've got a few more non-creatures in there. So for starters, we got a mana geode. We got a little bit more mana ramp there with the arcane signet as well. And honestly, I should have probably put the signet in the first time. I think it completely just went over my head when I was looking originally. Just so that we have a better chance of getting Conrad out faster, and then if he eats removal, we're able to replay him again, so we don't lose as much. Finale of Eternity was also an addition, since it returns all creatures from my graveyard to the battlefield. Yes, late game again, but if we're able to stall it out for that long, then it gets tremendous value, and it's also still solid removal, regardless, for wiping out potentially 3 things. Maybe even blowing up some of my things if I've got some threats to get rid of on the opponent's side, and have a spare thing that I can just blast to get an extra Conrad trigger. However, probably the most questionable change when I saw him doing it, when it was the approach he was going for, and definitely not something that I thought, was he really wanted to get Field of the Dead to be able to run in this deck. Since it makes more zombies, which is a good board presence, it gives me more stuff to work with Conrad, since it is another creature, not non-token. However, the issue with a monocolored deck, splashing this many cards to have the requirement to trigger Field of the Dead really hurt it. Like things like, oh, Lotus Field will be fine. How will it hurt you? It's not going to hurt you in the slightest. Except it's a tapped land. If this was a swamp, then I just play it. I'm up 1 mana, and then we're good to go. Whereas playing this, I sacrifice 2 lands, and then next turn I'm at 1 mana. So didn't exactly do much. Mobilize District, it's all fine and dandy and all that, but alongside Emergent Zone, but it just ended up being there's so many of them stacked up that just don't do anything for the deck. And I did end up with some hands where I just had so much colourless in my hand, and I was going so slowly because I was cracking Evolving Wilds to go and grab swamps when it once again could have just been a swamp. And I really didn't enjoy the feel of how that was playing. Now, I did feel that the additional mana ramp was a good thing, and it did improve the deck. It did run better with Conrad, but I feel that the mana base itself sort of let it down to some extent, because, as I said afterwards, pushing for Field of the Dead, especially with the number of lands there, because I think it's 7, right? 7 more lands with different names. So Field of the Dead, Swamp, Castle Lochthwain, Witch's Cottage, and Command Tower would be the 5 that I'd willingly have in the deck regardless for triggering that. So we only need 2 more, but then, we've got Lotus Field, Mobilized District, as 2 more, which are possibilities. There we go, we've got exactly 7. So I have to get all of my non-basics out for it to now trigger. The rest of the ones in here, Cryptic Caves, Emergent Zone, Evolving Wilds, Fabled Passage, Lotus Field, all requiring sacrificing of lands, are, yeah. Well, with these ones sacrificing, and Blaststone as well, which I think was in the original deck, because once again it's more removal. But all of those are effects that require sacrificing. So they're coming down, making colourless mana, and if I want to activate Field of the Dead, I can't use their effects. So maybe later on they would become useful, but it was such a niche scenario, it just wasn't going to work out. So that brings us on to the third build, which actually, finally, got a win. It had a bit of a messy setup to that, but it did actually manage to perform well enough to get some wins. And it's now actually a much more even split between creatures and non-creatures, where I'm focusing less on Syr Konrad getting down a bunch of creatures and just flooding the board. Flooding the graveyard with triggers from Konrad to kill them. And I focused more on controlling out the board, stalling out the game, filling out my graveyard a bit, yes, here and there, but predominantly I needed to make sure that things were dying and that I was able to stay alive. So Bag of Holding, to cycle through things a little bit more, since technically if I discard a creature card, it does trigger Konrad, and then it goes to exile and triggers Konrad again. I threw in Scuttlemutt, which is a colourless creature that can tap for mana. I have more removal, like Price of Fame, Spark Harvest, Kaya's Ghost Form as a means of protecting Konrad so that Konrad can come back, and just effects like that. Black Lance Paragon, who can flash in and essentially count as a one-turn, effectively a creature murder. Things like that. Command the Dreadhorde, which I think I didn't have when I originally made the deck, and decided against crafting it because I wanted to see how well Konrad was working first. And at some point I just went, you know what, this isn't working in the slightest. Command the Dreadhorde will help. Bolus's Citadel as well, just as a means of going through, since once again I have a much lower curve, whereas the first build was pretty averaged out across the board, and then a lot less giant to just hopefully deal that last bit of damage to the opponent at the end. And this deck did actually actually ran well and managed to get a win, which was better than all of the other builds had done so far. I think that was the mistake I was making with the others, is building around the final ability and the getting creatures into graveyard with Konrad is a good idea. It benefits Konrad to have that effect, because otherwise you might as well be running Ayara, who is honestly probably better as the commander for a Brawl deck if you're going for mono black. But hey, I wanted to make it work with Konrad, and I figured that at the end of the day, he also cares about opponent's creatures dying, get some more removal in, have the ability to clear the board, keep control, and then eventually in the late game start capitalizing on the fact that I've got to the point where Konrad's able to come down and I can trigger Konrad. Interestingly, the cat combo has also come out of this build. I forgot about that. Oh, and the other thing that came out was unfortunately the Cauldron, which, yeah, I hoped that it would work well and would synergize with Konrad, but unfortunately it really didn't. It saw basically no play, since I either drew it too late or didn't draw it at all, and then in the games where it was down, Konrad wasn't, and just it never really was working out, and I didn't have enough good payoff cards to capitalize on it. So that was my attempt at building Konrad in Eldraine Standard. Now, let's get some gameplay going and just quickly go over what cards have been introduced in Theros Beyond Death, in Mono Black and artifacts as well, that are worthy of consideration. So, first off, the mythic Erebos, Bleak-Hearted, the Black God for Theros. He's got a pretty good body, a pretty formidable force to have on the field, and I am playing a pretty low game with a bunch of cheap creatures that I then want to die later, and he does have a sack outlet on it to then debuff opponent's creatures to potentially help in killing them. So there's definitely an argument for him being run, especially when he then also allows me to pay life to draw cards, which is another effect that can be useful, would have a positive impact. It's probably a fair consideration. It gives me another means of drawing cards that I can keep things up, and I do expect to probably have a lot more life gain going on this time round. Next up, Timorak Calls the Dead. If I stick in some more zombies, because I do have zombies in this deck already. The last build had 5 in it, so it's not the largest number. I'm not necessarily going to get the most value from it, but it gives me a means of milling myself, which can then benefit Konrad if he's down, and then also creating zombies, which just benefits in general, and then also gains me more life and gives me some scry. It's not the most potent. It's a potential consideration that I'd probably play around with if I pull one in a pack, but I don't think I'm going to go out of my way to craft it, especially since, as I mentioned, the extra mill is nice with Konrad, but the issue I was running into was Konrad just wasn't performing with, wasn't lasting long enough on the field, or getting onto the field early enough to capitalize on any of those style effects. Euphemia, the Cacophony. It's a legendary creature, so it could potentially, on its own, be a commander deck. A Brawl deck. The commander of a Brawl deck. There we go. Words. It is probably not going to go in. I'm focusing more for creatures for Konrad, and having to then put in enchantments. Yes, there's enchantment creatures, and an enchantment creature or two may find their way into the deck, as well as, as I mentioned earlier, Erebos. Erebos would be a good option, but I then have to focus more of the deck around enchantments to get the payoff for it, and I think that, honestly, at that point, it would be better to just build around Euphemia as a deck. Erebos's Intervention. Now, Erebos's Intervention. This is a card that is ultimately going to come down to how good Escape turns out to be. I think that it's going to be a good card for this deck because it's an X spell that gains me life and kills a creature with one side of it. On that front, it's got value. Obviously it is an X, so I do have to pump mana into it to deal with anything that's big, but I can also then take advantage of them. Oh, you're blocking my small thing that's attacking. Well, I'll shrink your thing down so they trade or whatever. But the other thing is, I can exile cards from graveyards. Twice X cards from graveyards. Not target player's graveyard, just graveyards in general. So the cards are targeted individually. I can target cards in my graveyard, I can target cards in my opponent's graveyard. Once again, going back to Konrad, I can capitalize on Konrad's ability if I've got cards in my graveyard that I want to exile, because they're not as good to recur, and will get me the triggers from Konrad, whilst also hosing the opponent's deck so that they're not going to be able to bring things back from their graveyard. It is one, though, that is completely going to be dependent on how the meta shapes out, because I think there's better spot removal for single targets than Erebos's Intervention, and exiling my own stuff isn't exactly beneficial that much, unless I'm actually going to push for the win with Konrad at that point. But if the graveyards require that extra bit of a nudge with target removal because of Escape, then I can see it working out there. Eat to Extinction. Yeah, it's probably going in. It's able to exile creatures or planeswalkers, which is already good in my book. Planeswalkers are a problem. Planeswalkers have significantly fewer targeted removal options, and being able to remove one is a benefit, especially when planeswalkers can be commanders in Brawl. So whilst the exile doesn't benefit Conrad directly, being able to look at the top card of my library and put it into graveyard does. Since I'm not going to put a card into graveyard that I want, and if it's a creature, then once again, Conrad benefit. Gravebreaker Lamia is an interesting one as well. It's a 4/4 with lifelink, which is a decent-ish body, and given it's got a grave burial, I can't remember the name of the card, a burial effect where it's tutoring for a card into graveyard on it. It's fair for the cost, and being able to make spells I cast from graveyard cheaper is a benefit, but it also is a matter of how many things in graveyard do I have that I can actually cast, because Gutter Bones, as an example, doesn't cast itself from graveyard, it returns itself from graveyard to the battlefield. The Cauldron of Eternity doesn't cast creatures from graveyard, it returns them, so they're not cheaper. So it's only really going to be the escape cards, which comes down to whether or not I intend to use the escape cards. It's a consideration, depending on how much escape ends up in there. I think I'm probably underestimating it. I'm going to be 100% honest. I think I'm underestimating Lamia's potential. Or is it Lamia? I don't know. Nightmare Shepherd. Yeah, I think I'm probably considering this one. Because it's a May, if it's something that I want to or I'm able to reanimate, then I can bring it back immediately. If Conrad is on the field, in fact that's another good point, if Conrad dies, I can have him go to graveyard, exile him with Nightmare Shepherd, have the exile go back to command zone, and make the Conrad token. So I can then get the effect of it until they remove that Conrad, and then I can replay the fresh Conrad. So yeah, he's 100% going in. Because it's a May trigger and not required, it's a win-win. Now, Will Strider is our first escape card to look at here. It enters the battlefield and makes a goat, which we can immediately sacrifice to scry. The goat can be a chump blocker to buy us time. Having a sack outlet that is just immediately activated and not a case of having any cost means that I can do it any time. So I can get around a lot of targeting things in the same way that you use the Witch's Oven to make targets fizzle. It's not able to sacrifice itself is the one downside with that, but because it then would hopefully go to graveyard and be able to escape as a 5/4 for 5, as well as being a 3/2 for 3 at 3 mana, it's at least aggressively costed mana-wise with its base body. Aggressively costed, reasonably costed, and then being able to sacrifice creatures immediately is a good effect, because then, oh, Conrad's going to die, well, I'll sacrifice some creatures, get some triggers from Conrad, sacrifice Conrad, scry so that I have something good for the next turn. And then also having a goat as an additional blocker or an additional sacrifice and another trigger for Conrad when it dies, everything about it screams to me that this will benefit the deck. Since, oh, I milled it, well, I'll escape with it. Will Strider is a very strong entry into the deck. Outside of the main set itself, we do still have a couple of other cards worthy of consideration. First among these is Underworld Sentinel. Its effect does allow us to get things out of the graveyard again and get more triggers, and when it dies, bring all of those creatures back. However, it's a lot more risky than Nightmare Shepherd since it's not a May trigger. If it dies, it gets the trigger, so if someone removes it through exile, or if it's returned to my hand and I've not got an immediate way of getting rid of it through a sack outlet, then all of those creatures will be exiled for good. So it's kind of competing with Nightmare Shepherd in that regard, since yes, they're not a strict competition, since their effects are different, but they're both returning things by exiling the things, and I think Nightmare Shepherd's the better one, first and foremost. However, if that effect turns out to be particularly potent and works out really well for me, then Underworld Sentinel could be shortly following it into the deck. Mindrack Harpy is in the Ashiok Planeswalker deck, and if I decide that with Escape I can justify going a lot more creature heavy again, sticking in a few more effects to benefit from that, then Mindwreck Harpy will be first on the list as an inclusion, since being able to mill 3 cards from both players each turn gives such a large amount of mill. That's then able to set up, it's a potential 6 damage from Konrad max. I'm probably going to hit at least something, so I can see it working out. However, with the latest build that I'm going for, with fewer creatures, the mill's more likely to hurt me, and with escape as well, is more likely to help the opponent. Lampad of Death's Vigil. Sacrifice a creature for 1 mana. Each opponent loses 1 life and you gain 1 life. It's another sack outlet. It works really well with stuff like Gutter Bones. It's able to then keep coming back, because if they lose the life, I can immediately pay to bring back Gutter Bones. Obviously, I then have to pay a lot, 3 mana, to bring it back, but it does work fairly well in that regard. And so it gets an additional couple of drains in, and because it's able to come down early, I can then make use of it if necessary, if things are getting targeted to be removed. And also, when Konrad hits the field, then I can start pumping actual value from it. And because it can also sacrifice itself, it's able to have that extra little bit of a plus there. Grey Merchant of Asphodel, or Gary as he's often known. I am expecting to have a lot of small creatures down that will eventually die, hopefully after Konrad hits the board. However, Gary is a great value engine if I've managed to get that board up at that stage, since he deals... each opponent loses X life, and I gain life equal to the amount lost, where X is my devotion to black. With a lot of... with it being a mono-black deck, I can afford to run a lot of the high black black devotion cards. IRA is already in there as an example. Konrad's got 2 himself. So Gary should hopefully get a fair amount of value when he hits the board. He's a good thing to bring back from the graveyard because he gets an additional trigger, and because he's giving me life as well as dealing the damage, making the opponent lose that much life. He drains for large chunks of life that will then keep me alive for longer to hopefully be able to just end the game. I think Gary's probably going in there straight away. I think I'm not going to really hesitate about that. Inevitable End is an option, since it's a decent option for removing my opponent's creatures. I stick it on something, they could sacrifice it immediately and they lose a creature, but if I'm sticking on something, it's a worthwhile creature that they're going to want to keep, presumably. And if they don't, and they have other things that they keep sacrificing, then Konrad still gets triggers. I'm still able to clear things off the board. So it's got potential use there. But once again, it's a matter of seeing what removal options come into play. Same thing with Minions Return. It's got flash, so it's a bit more of a surprise when it comes in. And I can either bring back something of mine that an opponent has rudely killed, or get something good back from the opponent that's about to die for whatever reason. So it's got some potential there for getting good value out of my opponent, since there's surprisingly little that gets cards back from your opponent's graveyards at the moment, and it could very well be somewhat to do with the fact that we're about to have a graveyard set, and that could be pretty good. Now, Maya Triton, I think, is a pretty good option. It puts me up a little bit of life, gives me a little bit more room to work with, gives me a blocker that will trade with an opponent's creature, and put some cards in the graveyard which can trigger Konrad. So it's a good cheap option for the 2 mana slot, and may go in the place of Oars of Enforcer, though I think I'll probably put it alongside Oars of Enforcer more likely than not. Verika's Spawn is the other major escape card that I'm considering. It's a 3/4 for 4, which isn't that impressive if I just cast it, and it's 6 mana for a 5/6 if you escape it, which only requires 3 cards to be exiled, and when it enters the battlefield as a result of escaping, each opponent sacrifices a non-Gorgon creature. So it's able to serve as removal, as well as being a creature that I'm fine with getting into the graveyard. The only downside is that is 6 mana, but it's 6 mana for a 5/6 that also gets rid of one of the opponent's creatures. So I can see that working. I can see that filling the graveyard gap of this deck. Underworld Dreams is another card that I'm considering that, although it doesn't directly help the graveyard theme of the deck, it does do incremental damage over time from opponents drawing cards, something they tend to want to do. And it does also provide 3 Devotion to Black, which can help cards like Erebos and Gary. Its inclusion is going to be up in the air, however, for the fact that it doesn't fit with what the deck's trying to do, barring the fact that it's a slow amount of drain. It could benefit then from a lot of stalling tactics to have that incremental drain constantly ticking on the opponent. There's definitely pros to running it. It is, however, a completely conditional one that is probably early on the chopping block. Cling to Dust is a card that I'm torn on. If I cast it from my hand, it's a decent cost. I can escape it from the graveyard, so it's already able to be played multiple times. The issue is, though, with 5 cards being exiled, it's a significant amount that I'm getting rid of to get its effect again. Yes, I can potentially get a lot of drain from Konrad through the exiles, but it's still a sharp investment that if I'm not able to finish my opponent off with it then and there, doesn't particularly seem too worthwhile, especially when I've got other escape cards in the deck, and using up as many as I would on that when it costs 4 mana to play from the graveyard as well, so it's a large mana investment plus a large amount of my graveyard just to be able to get a relatively minor effect. It feels a little bit too costly to make worth running. Fruit of Theros, on the other hand, is probably slightly closer to being considered to be put in. It's, once again, a cheap cost if I draw it to get a little bit of life loss from the opponent, but I can then also I only have to exile 3 cards as opposed to 5, so I can use it more frequently, and then that just becomes straight up 5 life loss, with less cards being exiled from the graveyard. Both of these cards are, however, not completely dismissed. They're just sort of sidelined, because I need to play with Escape first, and get a general grasp of how full my graveyard is likely to be, how often I'm going to be able to escape with things. Funeral Rites is a card I'm really not considering for this deck too much. The card draw isn't all that good when I've got creatures and a Planeswalker that allows me to get repeated value from my creatures dying, so I can just run creatures that I want to die instead. The extra cards from the library into graveyard isn't too much of a benefit to justify the cost for the card, and so it just comes across as a decent limited card, but not one that I'm going to stick into a constructed deck like this one. Soul Reaper of Mogus is, I'm pretty sure, functionally the same effects as Spark Reaper, I think it was, from War of the Spark, although it's 2 black as opposed to 3 generic. It's probably not going in. It's too expensive for the effect, and I think there's enough cards to compete in its slot to go in, and I think that being an enchantment creature will be a benefit if I am running Timoret's, well, either Ephemia or Timoret Falls the Dead, but as it stands, probably not going to go in there. Underworld Charger is another escape card. I was originally considering it since over Woestrider, because it's a 5/5 rather than a 5/4, but I think what I missed when I was doing that initial read over it was I missed the sacrifice ability in between the making of the goat, and yeah, that sacrifice ability makes all of the difference. So yeah, it's another option. Might be good to just have a few more options in there, since there's a 5 mana 5/5, but because it can't block, it's only going to be on the offensive, so if the opponent's got better stuff, then it's not going to do much there, and it's not got any evasion on it, so it's rather questionable. Venomous Hierophant. It's a death touch creature that's going to slow the opponent attacking, and it puts cards from my library into the graveyard, so it ticks those boxes, but it's once again a space issue. Having another death toucher when I think the Triton Merfolk works better by being cheaper, milling only 1 card less and gaining me life, makes it the better option. since the 3 power, 3 toughness on the body doesn't really matter that much when it comes to Death Touch. It's likely going to trade into something that will kill it, and at that point, the 2-1's going to work better. The only advantage this really has is Ritual of Soot misses it. And with that covers all of the black cards that are in the set that I can talk about, which leaves the artifacts. There are likely only 2 artifacts that I'm considering, maybe 3. The first of which is Nyx Lotus. Add mana equal to the amount of devotion you have to that colour. I am a mono-black deck. I am most likely going to always be able to produce mana with this, and hopefully I'll be able to create a lot of mana with this, which I can pump solely into Konrad, and also being able to then repeatedly cast Konrad. Having that mana available to me will be such a godsend. And in fact, I mentioned earlier with Gary being the only thing that likely would care about devotion and Erebos. I forgot about Lotus for a moment. Yeah, Lotus is the card that I think will provide the mana necessary to make Konrad a little bit more relevant as a creature-heavy deck than other options. Since if I'm able to play a lot of devotion early on to have that Lotus produce a lot of mana, then Konrad can come down and immediately start milling. And then if Konrad goes away, I can then Lotus again and probably still cast Konrad. The mana generation it potentially provides is top-notch, and I'm heavily considering it as a result of that. The same thing goes with Altar of the Pantheon to some extent, just because it increases the amount of devotion you have by 1, so it effectively counts as having the devotion I need. Is a mana rock for any colour, so it can replace one of the other options potentially in that slot, so that once again I can ramp up to Konrad faster, and if I control a legendary enchantment, a god or a demigod, I gain life. That last bit is slightly less relevant. I'm likely to have a god in there, maybe 2 if we have Bond 2. But it will potentially provide some decent value there. And the final card of just an honourable mention note is Shadow Sphere, since it gives trample and lifelink, +1/+1, and can pay 1 to make permanents opponents control lose hexproof and indestructible until end of turn, which will be no doubt useful for killing things with Konrad and Pels, or just being able to target them for various effects. Konrad, being equipped with it, because Konrad does have a decent amount of power on him, not the best toughness, but yeah, he gets champ blocked a lot, or doesn't get to attack because the opponent's got more creatures. But even then, just there's definitely some utility to it. It's not a high consideration, since I'm not sure where I'd find the space for it, and I'm also not 100% convinced on how much I'd need it, but it's on the table. It's an option that's there that could be worth considering, just because it's a good card. Now, that covers pretty much everything that I want to about the deck for now. I do hope that I'll actually be able to make something that works more than winning just a single game. So I hope you enjoyed. It's definitely something a bit different. I'll maybe do some for some other decks that I've built previously, just go over some cards that I'd include in them, but I'm more likely to, at this stage, just remake the decks, add the new cards to it, and just make another video on them at that point with the updated list, given that this is sort of that awkward period where it's between that period where we've got all of the cards, we know what cards are there, we know what we can build, but we've not got access to actually play with them yet. So that's obviously the plans for the future if I'm looking at updating the decks. There's obviously a lot of new creatures that can be built around, and also planeswalkers, I am really liking the design and flavour of Ashiok, and I am 100% going to make an Ashiok deck at some point. Maybe even the first one that I go for. But yeah, there's plenty of other options that are just going to be fun to build around, and I'm looking forward to it. Not looking forward to the fact that Brawler Days has come back, and that is going to cost another 10,000 gold, because as I said last time, I'm not a fan of having a paywall to play a basic game mode that you then get access to free for Wednesday, when the reasoning it's only on Wednesday was originally stated to quite clearly be, we're worried that we're not going to have enough players, queue times are going to be long, and people are going to stop playing it because of the fact that queue times are long from nobody playing it. And yet here you are, happily splitting your player base by putting in a massive, massive paywall for not getting anything of value outside of being able to play a mode you should already be able to play, and can play if you're willing to actually use the direct match system at any time. So, regardless of that, I hope you enjoyed the video. If you've made a Konrad deck or have ideas for Konrad deck, because I did play against one which was a lot more removal focused than even my third one. That worked quite well. I'm happy to see any suggestions for it, because I really, really want to make Konrad work. So if you've got ideas, if there's any cards that I've missed completely, then remind me of them. Give me some reasonings why you'd think that it would work well, and hey, maybe we'll just be able to finally make it work to a standard that I'm happy with. So without further ado, hope you guys all enjoyed the video. Take care, and I'll see you next time.